Okay. Good evening, everyone. I'm Stephen Aaron. I'm the chair of the UCLA History Department, and I'm delighted to welcome you to this evening's edition of our Why History Matters series, in which today we will examine history in the classroom, controversy across cultures. Those of you who are regular attendees at our Why History Matters series know that we explore a range of issues, of contemporary issues, seeking to bring historical perspective to inform us about the challenges we have faced and the choices we have made, and the choices we can make. On the one hand, this evening's program brings us, or takes us halfway around the world to discuss controversies about history curriculum in Israel and Palestine. On the other hand, the program also takes us and brings us close to home, because we'll also look at curricular battles across the United States and in California. As you'll hear from our panelists this evening, there's much at stake in these struggles about how to teach histories and what histories we teach. The Why History Matters series was initiated, I think now 7 years ago, by my predecessor as chair of the UCLA History Department, David Myers, and it's wonderful and appropriate that this evening's program is his inspiration, part of a multi-day conference that he has organized or co-organized here at UCLA, and part of a broader project in which he has been engaged and about which he can explain more. I'm pleased that David is also, in addition to being here to moderate this evening's panel, that David also has agreed to serve as the founding director of our new Luskin Center for History and Policy, made possible by the remarkable generosity and vision of Meyer and Rini Luskin. This center, the Luskin Center, like the Why History Matters series, will allow us to bring historical knowledge to bear on a host of policy concerns at the local, the state, the regional, the national, and the international levels. It will enable us also to harness the talents of the faculty and students in the UCLA History Department, working in collaboration with our colleagues across campus and beyond this campus to make history matter in realms where understanding of the past is essential if we are to create a better and perhaps more peaceful future. David Myers.
Good evening, everyone. It's really a delight to be here with you to explore these really engrossing and important issues that relate to our work as educators at all levels. Tonight is really the convergence of three happy factors. The first is this is one of our Why History Matters quarterly events, a series that is very near and dear to me, and I'm delighted that we have the opportunity to combine this with a second proximate cause, which is the two-day conference that we've been holding devoted to history and education in Israel and Palestine. This is one of the ways in which we at UCLA really try to bring the past alive, to address issues of great contemporary relevance, but to do so by bringing the depth of perspective drawn from serious historical research. And the third vector in that happy convergence is, as Steve mentioned, the fact that this is one of the first events to be co-sponsored by the new UCLA Luskin Center for History and Policy. The center, as Steve mentioned, owes its vision to the generosity of our dear friends, Meyer and Rini Luskin, and I would like to pause here to thank them publicly for their remarkable generosity. What is remarkable is the generosity of spirit in these two people, as well as the keen intelligence and understanding that our moment demands the kind of inquiry that we hope to undertake at the Luskin Center for History and Policy. In the words of the ancient sage, if not now, when? If not at this moment in history, when would we need the depth of perspective that history offers to inform public conversation, civic engagement, and policy deliberation more generally. So we're really delighted to have the opportunity to launch the center. We'll begin with our formal activities in the fall of 2017 with a range of public programs and research initiatives. Please check our forthcoming website for information about all of these events. So tonight's event indeed marks a happy convergence of these various campus-wide factors and vectors, but our topic is a very serious one, a very sober one. It's about the way we teach our children and train them to become active members in society. I needn't belabor the point, but the stakes are very high. It would be nice if, when we taught our children about the past, we could all agree on a single, seamless, objective account, the way it actually happened, as the 19th century Prussian historian Ranke famously said. But alas, we can't. History, for all the historians' meticulous sifting of data, remains a fundamentally interpretive enterprise, subject to the vagaries of the interpreter and the time. Similarly, history, or for that matter, civics textbooks, are not embodiments of timeless truths, but very much a function of the accumulated and curated knowledge of the past, shaped by the shifting political and social winds of the day. Now, recent confirmation of this, if we needed any, came just last week. I don't know if any of you saw this, when the newly elected president of South Korea, Moon Jae-in, called for the removal of the state-sponsored history textbooks introduced by his disgraced and now jailed predecessor. But does this mean that history and historical textbooks are merely tools of political ideology and propaganda? Does this render history irrelevant? I don't think so. There are recognized norms and consensual standards in the profession that allow us to gain deep insight into the past. And yet we should be mindful that there are always multiple angles through which to view the past, and that at best we can arrive at what the English philosopher R.G. Collingwood called relative truth. With that in mind, let's turn to our subject of the evening, history in the classroom, controversy across cultures. Our four panelists are themselves a cross-cultural mix, two Americans, an Israeli, and a Palestinian. I'll introduce them all briefly and then pose an opening question to each one of them, after which we'll have a conversation, and time permitting, we'll open it up to a Q&A after that. So before I introduce our speakers, I do want to just thank a number of people, including my dear friend Steve Aaron, the UCLA History Department, and Peter Evans and his staff from Social Science Development for allowing us to occupy this space and engage in this conversation. So thank you to all of you. So let me begin with our first panelist, Professor Sami Adwan, who is Vice President for Academic Affairs and a professor at Hebron University. Sami, I must say, is really the reason we are here, since he has been a pioneer in developing and promoting a dual narrative approach to the history of Israel and Palestine, producing books that juxtapose side by side the history of Israel and Palestine, books such as Side by Side, which I encourage you all to pick up, and Learning Each Other's Historical Narrative, both of which, I should say, I'm using in a seminar on dual narrative approaches to history. And my students have enjoyed and profited enormously from use of these books. Welcome to you, Sami.
Thank you.
Next is Ross Dunn, Professor Emeritus of History at San Diego State, who has been a national leader, along with our UCLA colleague, Gary Nash, in producing diverse and culturally inclusive history curricula and standards, a cause, I should add, that incurred the wrath, quite famously, of the chairwoman of the National Endowment for the Humanities, Lynn Cheney, in 1994, and induced a round of history wars that in some sense continue to this day. So welcome to you, Ross, a history warrior. Next is Mary Hendra, who is the Associate Program Director of the LA Office of Facing History and Ourselves, a remarkable organization established, I couldn't believe this, Mary, in 1976, more than 40 years ago, to develop historical curricula intended to combat bias and injustice. Facing History began by introducing curricula relating to the Holocaust, which had a really transformative effect on K through 12 education across the country, but has since expanded well beyond that. Welcome, Mary. And finally, Halleli Pinson is a senior lecturer in the Department of Education at the Ben-Gurion University in Beersheba, Israel. She is a sociologist of education with a critical perspective on the intersection of citizenship, gender, minority rights, and education. And we will be talking with her tonight about civics education and civics textbooks, principally in Israel. So welcome to you, Halleli. I'm going to, I think, now take us, no, I'm going to stay here because I have to operate this, and I may migrate over to sit. But let me open with you, Sami. What led you to think about and then develop a dual narrative curriculum? What were the historical conditions of the moment? And what was the opportunity or challenge that you saw?
Thank you. Good evening, all, and I'm happy to be part of this panel. Going back in the early 90s when the first, tried to analyze the Palestinian and Israeli school books, and in that context where Oslo Agreement was signed, and it allowed for Palestinian and Israeli to work together jointly and separately, it created really what we call it people-to-people project. And that's when we start analyzing the school textbooks, the basic finding is very clear. It's not surprising for us, but it's very clear that neither side teach about the other side. Each side teach about himself in a good way, and also, he always, the side that's really do good things, always look for, try to create peace. The other side is presented in a negative way whenever it's presented. Sometimes you find the other, cultural, history, religion aspect is not mentioned. So here we're looking at both side textbooks as if they are, textbooks that really generate negation of the existence of the others. The other is not there. Their presentation is very negative. So we found out that if this continue, that education in both sides, it only prepare generations that really support the conflict and the continuation of conflict. There's a lot of limitation of knowledge that is offered in both side textbooks. So that's the idea came, to try out, to be able to develop a material that can be used in Palestine and in Israel, in both schools. That's the idea of dual narrative starts. Of course, dual narrative as a starting point, with the assumption that each side in engaging in conflict, and it's also it applies to the Palestinian-Israeli context, that each side has one narrative. And but in reality, each side has multi-narrative exists, but the one that surfaces in the conflict usually the master historical narrative that's presented. So we recruited teachers. We try to recruit teachers, and the teachers work with us from the beginning and try to write the narrative and put it side by side. And it's a very competing processes. It's very emotional. It's very challenging. It's not as easy process. You try to create symmetry between narrative in a space and the size, but the reality is not a symmetry. So the condition out there is really difficult. And when you try really to work against the mainstream, authority or formal structures, the ministries, that gives you another challenge, because the textbooks in both Israeli schools and in Palestinian schools are completely controlled by both ministries. So here, you cannot really change textbooks if you want from top down. So that's why we started what we call it from bottom up to try to create a process and a model to influence textbooks. Of course, our approach was not accepted by both ministries, and it was rejected, and was, we were cursed, condemned, smeared, you name it. But at least we tried to present a material and a model that can be used in both side textbooks. And why we do that is to move people from completely negating that to recognize this narrative exists. It doesn't mean yet you have to legitimize it. It doesn't mean you have to reconstruct your own narrative. It's a matter of introduction. And we think in the long run, that will help in recognizing the existence of other, reconciliation, and hopefully it lead to peace education. Though we started as if it is peace education, but now we call it educational development models, because now it's become very well known internationally. Locally, we denied, we were not recognized. Internationally, we were really welcomed and supported and valued, and we won many prizes for this. And it became an international also material to be used not in the Palestinian and Israeli schools all over the world. So that's why the book that we produce is available in English, in Hebrew, Arabic, German, and the booklet available in Italian, French, and also Spanish. So that's part of it. So hopefully that will create a shift in how education, or curtail a little bit from education, from continuing perpetuating the conflict to a way of developing peace. And that's what. And why history is important? It's really important because history is the mechanism and the means why we are here and how we think. And also it's not, how we are here and what is our identity, how we relate to ourselves and others. Also, it's really set a platform how we see the future. So when we teach about history, actually we understand who we are now, and also we help us understand how the future will be. Dealing with historical narrative, it's a very delicate situation. It's not an easy process because it really has so much emotion involved, and both sides, both teachers from both sides feel responsible what they would say, what they would write. Would that will be undermining their ancestors? Will they be able to develop a material that's really against the mainstream media that really exists? So the teacher has to be supported also to be able to deal with narrative when it comes to teaching history. And moving teaching from one perspective to dual perspective, multi-narrative, it's really a process that is being changed. It's not, it's not just benefit to the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, which is, of course, it's important because we did that in time of conflict, but it's relevant all over the world. So we'll be able to work locally to develop material, but internationally has global effects.
I'm curious about the connection between curriculum development and political conditions, about which I asked. You began your efforts on Prime when?
We started in 1998 in Prime.
Okay, so in the later Oslo years.
Yeah. When we started Prime actually in 1998, it was the time we were hoping that peace deal will be done so close. We felt it. We felt it. At least there's so many grassroots works and there was so many people-to-people project. And it happened that when Camp David II meeting, Clinton, Barack, and Arafat met in 2000, we thought we are so close, and we were meeting in Stockton here, and we write a letter to them, please don't come out without it. Unfortunately, did not succeed to strike a deal for different reasons, different explanation, but we decided to continue. And now the continuation is a very difficult because what we call, peace building in conflict, in open conflict, and also without permission from both ministries, and also the pressure of political group and social group for the teachers and for us, it becomes difficult even for the Palestinian teacher to move from place to place, for Israeli teachers also to feel safe to come to meet to the Palestinian. It's really a very psychological difficulty for both Israeli and Palestinian teachers. From one side, the Palestinian will be stopped at the checkpoint, treated in a very harsh way, delayed, and after 1 hour, 2 hours, he's sitting around with Israeli teachers. The Israeli teachers also coming from their way, feeling unsafe to be reached to the point and being able to, reach to the Palestinian round table. I think the challenge is more deeper than this, because also how these teachers will be able to tell what they have been doing in these meetings to their community. And we found out very few of them were able or dare to speak to their spouses or friends or colleagues about what they do. So that's one side which is really limiting. So they feel sometimes vulnerable. What will happen if I tell my wife or my husband what I'm doing, or my colleagues, what will be their reaction? So it takes a lot of psychological really energy and psychological problems to overcome these fears and these. And we feel that the teacher, most of them are very committed to the cause. And I could say that one teacher said, this is what things I can do to secure my children's future. And that's really something makes sense. Other teachers said, now I will be able to teach my even narrative in a better way after I'm learning about the other side narrative. So the fear and the concern that learning of the other side narrative will weaken you or really undermine your narrative, that's not the case what we found. We found it's encouraging, even motivate teachers and the pupils of school even to learn more and more about their narrative and about the other narrative. Now I know how they behave. I know why they behave their way. Now we have responsibility. Now what we would do. So sharing common responsibility is a very important thing. We didn't get support from the government and the community in general, but some, effects that this has been moved from prime team to the teachers, to the school, and it moved from children to the parents. So children start going back to their parents and ask them, you told us this, but now we learn another thing. So which one is right? So that's created discussions, and by the virtue of creating discussions, actually it's creating a space, open space between the individual and the history to be open for critics and for discussions and also for reflections. We did achieve a lot of things, but there's so much to be done.
Yeah.
Working against reality and the odds of reality, it's not an easy process.
It's interesting that the reality in which you began was, as you described, at a time of hope and opportunity experienced by many, say from 1993 to 2000, yes. The beginning of the Oslo, of the public phase of the Oslo peace process. In a similar period, there were countervailing developments in the United States, and this was a time of tremendous tension and conflict over the very nature of historical curricula as sort of the multicultural revolution was being felt. And many in the historical profession were really rethinking what the bounds of historical inquiry were, moving away from an old model of Western civilization to world history as an important category. And Ross, you have been very involved in the development of this very concept of world history that has now become absolutely central to our understanding of historical instruction from high school, from grade school, all the way up through university. So how did you, as an historian of Morocco, make your way to A, this concept of world history, and B, to the history wars that you and others were actively involved in?
First of all, let me thank you and Steve and others for inviting me to this panel tonight. I'm very happy to be here. I should say that Gary Nash, Emeritus Professor of History, should probably be here instead of me, but he told me that it takes so long to drive from the Pacific Palisades to UCLA at this time of
Talk
night.
about historical contingency.
Yeah, right. That he recommended me for the job, and gee, I got
We're
here
delighted to have
in
you.
no time. Yeah. Yes. I started out as a historian of Morocco, but not only that. I was privileged to go to graduate school at the University of Wisconsin when just after probably the first serious world history graduate program in this country was founded. It was led by Philip Curtin, who is now deceased, and it was based on comparative study of different parts of the world. And so I was immersed in that kind of study from the time I entered graduate school. But of course, I had to write my thesis, and I wasn't going to be encouraged to write a thesis on world history. So I found my niche, which was in North African history. In fact, the southeastern part of Morocco and southwestern Algeria during about a 30-year period. So that's what I did. But I came out of Wisconsin, fortunately or not, thinking that everybody does world history. And then I got to my first and only job at San Diego State University, and I found out that hardly anybody does world history or thinks about it. And we set out to change that, and the main reason was my graduate training, which was so different from that of most graduates, no matter what their field is. They're focused on a country or at best a single region. But going back to the work that Gary and I have done together, we learned, and he did most of the research on the fact that if we go back to, way back to the American Revolution, we discover that history in American schools has been controversial. Maybe not constantly, but periodically controversial to the point of crises breaking out from time to time, including the one that David mentioned, maybe especially the one that David mentioned that took place in the mid-1990s. So I think we all know that the study of United States history is inevitably controversial because the way we study the history of our own country is so tangled up with our competing and sometimes conflicting cultural and political ideologies that it's bound to happen. And it happens also because in the United States, we don't have a Ministry of Education. We don't have a Ministry of Culture. We don't have a national curriculum, especially one that is imposed on students by the state. We have state curricula, and in some states it's just local districts that set the curriculum. That's still very much the case. So world history has also been controversial, maybe not with the intensity of American history, but it's still been an important issue. And I'd like to introduce world history to this conversation because this has been very much an international conference, not just focused on the United States and its education. I might also mention that we teach more world history in American schools and universities, and by that I mean predominantly introductory world history, than assuredly any other country in the world. And in California, for example, I figure slightly more than 40% of the middle school and high school social studies curriculum is devoted to world history. And I'm very proud that we've accomplished that. Over many, many years of working with teachers around the country, with academics, with public officials, school administrators, I discovered, and I discovered this early on, that not everybody thinks about world history in the same way. A good deal less so than American history, because American history has a kind of central narrative that is pretty well accepted There are a lot of differences in what the emphasis should be, but there is a sort of central narrative, and you can see it in the textbooks because they're not that much different in the way they approach it. World history hasn't had a narrative like that, and some people say, it can't have one. But that's another question of debate. So what I've discovered is that there are all these different definitions of world history competing with one another. And I just put together a list of 5 definitions of world history that are in play in the United States, have been for some time, but currently more than ever. The first definition is of world history as the stuff that's not American history. And this point of view tends to conflate world history, world civilizations, world cultures, world geography, global studies, and I'm sure we can name several more that are all crammed together in the school curriculum. And I don't mean in the same school, but across the country, we see courses with all of these names. And I think that a large number of Americans, but also school administrators, think of world history in this rather nebulous way, as not having any particular conceptual structure, even though that's debated. It's just, this stuff that they learn about other parts of the world. The second definition is world history as world news. And I think this point of view tends to be associated especially with instructors in schools of education and teacher training. Maybe you'll correct me if I'm wrong, but and that's a view that comes out of the social studies movement. It goes back to the 1920s. That posits that what children really ought to be learning most about is contemporary issues, contemporary problems, contemporary crises. And that in focusing on that, history and the history discipline provide kind of background for predominantly contemporary study. So you use history in that way, but you're focused on the present for the most part. A third definition, and here's where we get into the serious controversies, is world history as synonymous with Western civilization. And before World War II, we could say that this is the way the way schools taught world history, and they called it world history. And their students did not necessarily know that it wasn't world history because they weren't learning about anything else. And the rationale for this is that what we need to know, what we need to teach in school is our history and our values and our culture, our way of government. And we need to focus on that, and we don't need to know nearly so much about other people's ways of government or cultural forms. Maybe some, but we don't need too much of it. So world history should be predominantly the history of Europe, in point of fact. Fourth definition is what I call world history as the parade of cultures. And this is a way of thinking about world history that really began to blossom in the 1970s or late 1960s. And it came along with the civil rights movement and other movements with people of greater diversity entering the graduate schools, entering the teaching profession, and thinking that world history can't be Western, it's got to be global and it's got to be inclusive. But the way many thought about it was that history needs to be the study of the ancestry of all Americans, particularly the major ethno-racial groups, African Americans, Asian Americans. Well, let's put it this way: the descendants of Africans, of Asians, of Latin Americans, of Native Americans, and then of course Europeans as well. And so we proceeded to write world history as though it could be organized into silos, each silo representing one of these ethno-racial groups, and that we would study their histories one at a time. The trouble is that students may have learned quite a lot about different parts of the world, but they weren't, in a broader sense, learning world history. So that brings me to the last definition, and this is the one you'll see that I subscribe to. And this is basically world history as human history. In other words, seeing that the primary goal of world history in schools ought to be the study of human beings as a species. Now, I don't mean that we're going to teach biology instead of history, but I do mean that we should start with human beings as very different from other kinds of animals, and that have had a history that we can look at from afar. We can peer down from, some have used this analogy, from outer space and look down upon the history of the world, so that the aim of world history becomes not to cover cultures. It becomes more of an aim to see the world as a whole and to pose questions about human development over time, including some really big questions about human development. It doesn't mean we don't study civilizations in that approach to world history. It means that civilizations are set within contexts larger than themselves, whether it's Afro-Eurasia as a whole or even the world as a whole. So there's nothing wrong with studying regional and local history, but it should be embedded in, situated in a student's sense of the world as a whole, gaining a mental architecture for thinking about the world as a whole, and big questions about the environment, about the economy, about human migration, as well as about culture A, B, and C. And certainly, although we would include Europe very much so in this approach to world history, it can't be dominant. And I think now where the political climate in the United States is such that we could have more trouble over world history in the future, because there are many who recognize that the United States must educate children in a way that makes them inquiry-minded, world-minded, ready to live in the world that we can't escape. I mean, we've got it. There's nothing we can do. Globalization will continue.
Right. Well,
And
one
so on.
interesting question, which we'll maybe double back to, is whether the new emphasis over the last 40 years or so on world history was itself a function of globalization, or what the relationship between this very significant development of interest in world history was relative to the advance of globalization. But I want to thank you for laying out those categories, and now turn to Mary and pick up on Ross's fourth category, which is to say the category that talks about discrete cultures and recovering. As I understood it, Ross, that model is very much connected to the effort to recover underrepresented or lost voices and give them a kind of visibility that they did not have before. And that's a project, Mary, that I often associate with Facing History. So maybe you can tell us a little bit about how Facing History goes about its work of curriculum development, particularly with a desire to capture diversity and yet at the same time stay abreast of shifting cultural and political winds of the day.
Sure.
And I know you have a slide, so I'm going to jump back over here.
Thank
and
you.
You'll cue me.
And I'll say one of the transition points is that I think Facing History has done an amazing job of, long before I was part of it, of raising some hidden histories to be more present. And so the eugenics movement in this country, the Armenian genocide, the Reconstruction era post-Civil War and what that means as a sample of democracy are some of those pieces that are not always studied well in school because there aren't a lot of materials about it, but present different narratives, present some histories that help students see themselves in a different way. With all of the history, so beginning with the Holocaust, I think Facing History is a very deliberate approach that says the reason we study history is because history is not inevitable. People make choices, and those choices make history. So if we approach history, the study of history, by looking at ordinary individuals and the choices they've made, their different narratives and the complexity of that, and the consequences that those choices have, we have a very different entry into history. And the next slide shows the Facing History approach. I'm not going to talk all the way through it, but I wanted to show it because I wanted to be able to give an example of what this means in practice. So 2 days after the election, I was facilitating a workshop for Facing History on the Armenian Genocide down in San Diego, actually. So I had about 20 teachers in the room, and Facing History starts with this approach where we say, you know what, if we're going to dive into history and look at the history of ordinary people, we need to start with identity and understand the complexity of identity. So we did this day by looking at some poetry written by Armenian Americans who are struggling with where do they fit, right? They no longer feel at home in the ancestral homes of Armenia. They don't consider that they belong, or they are not considered to fully belong in American history. American history is not their history, right? They fall under one of these diverse groups who's perhaps a minor narrative, not the master narrative, right? So in struggling this and articulating this through some beautiful poetry, they identify this tension. And these teachers reading these poems were reminded of the tension that their own students had been articulating the day before, right? So the day after an election, when a person was elected to office who in his rallies chanted "Build the Wall." And so some of these students down in San Diego said, how do I belong in this country where the person who now represents us has told me I don't belong, right? Where do I fit within that? And so this resonance for teachers of reading these historical passages and seeing the tension for their own students, right? And then having a tension themselves, right? They're teachers. They're also just adults in this society. So there's that tension of what they believe about the election in whatever way it is, but there's also this space they're creating for their students, with some students who are jubilant about an election, and some students who are devastated, and a lot of students who are going, what does this mean? Right? And the teachers having to navigate that tension, and what tension it is when, as a society, we've started to polarize and divide, as you can see in some of the we and they, right? That is very available to look at today, but it's also, there's a benefit for looking at it historically, so we can say, okay, let's look at a case study. Let's dive into some history that's not our own, that maybe feels a little bit less personal, a little bit less political, so that we can engage our analysis, and we can say, like, so what are the different peoples? What are the different experiences? How many narratives can we bring into this history? Teachers were making comparisons and making connections to themselves all day long. And I say comparisons, but I want to make it clear that it wasn't about making kind of false comparisons or simple comparisons. It was about diving into the history with such depth into that particular history that they could then reflect back on themselves. And the most poignant point for me was near the end of the day, when we had looked at the documents from the Young Turks. We looked at the images that Armin Wegner had taken. We looked at testimony of survivors of the genocide. And we had done much of this in a very silent gallery walk. So each person could really think and process and dive into this history in their own way. And when we broke the silence, there was a teacher, he'll say, entered the day at the beginning of the day, hands crossed, sunglasses on, 10 minutes late, and had joined in during the course of this time. He was the first one to speak when we broke the silence of this gallery walk, and he said, I was in the American military, and I was sent to Iraq, and we did some of the same things that we just read about. There is absolute silence in the room. Absolute silence. Because here this man had been looking at a history so deep that it allowed him to reflect on his own behavior. And the teachers as a group had created a space that was so phenomenal for this exploration that when he finished, there was silence. And then a young teacher, first-year teacher, African-American, who had been identifying, earlier during the day, his own struggles, actually as a gay African-American man, how he fit into society and into America. And he looked at that man and he said, "Thank you. I too was in the military. I'm a single father, and for that reason alone, I didn't have to go to Iraq, but I would have been in the same position that you are." And there is this moment of just, ability to have empathy, to have an opportunity for self-reflection, right? That I think is why we want to engage in history, right? We engage in history to learn about the past, but also to learn about ourselves, to learn about what choices we can make, and to think about the next choices we might make within it, and to really learn about what that might mean for others.
Thank you. Thank you. So let us, since you got us a little bit to the Middle East, let us stay there for a minute and turn our attention to Israel, which we know is a society that has a very high degree of consensus and very little controversy in it. And therefore, civics education proceeds in a kind of linear fashion without much disruption. I'm just kidding, Halleli. Tell us what you observe in civics education trends in Israeli society, and to what extent is curriculum development very much a function of political circumstance of the day?
Okay, so first, we had this conversation here. I was just thinking that I'm going to, this was so optimistic, and I'm, especially you, and I think I'm going to, kind of put everyone down now a little bit. And I mean, I know that you were joking when you're saying Israel is very consensual, but in a sense, a certain segment of Israeli society, especially when we're talking about the Jewish majority, is today becoming more and more consensual, and not in a very good way, in my perspective. And what I want to do is take you through what happened to citizenship education or civic education in Israel, basically mainly focusing on the last few years, but also giving a bit of a historical context of the last 40 years or so. So as a starting point, to say that until the 70s, a bit similar maybe to the US, there wasn't civic education per se. It was history, civics, geography was kind of lumped into one curriculum subject that's called Homeland and Nation. And I think the name reflects the narrative back then. During the 70s, there were a change in the whole perception of curricula in Israel. And in a sense, curricula started to move from more kind of recruited curriculum in order to facilitate nation building into more academic curricula. And in that point, the Ministry of Education decided to separate the history curricula and the history curriculum and civic curriculum into two different curriculums, when the civic curriculum back then was very much, I think the best way to describe it, it was kind of a constitutional law, learning about election procedures, legislation procedures, the rule of the courts, and etc. Having said that, it still enforced a very narrow, monolithic, nationalistic narrative of that obviously was the hegemonic Zionist narrative. During the 1990s, we're starting to see the curriculum shifts and more global notions and universal notions of citizenship kind of being introduced into the curriculum, while not challenging the nationalistic hegemonic discourse. I mean, and this is another thing that needs to be said. I just want to make one comment about the view of history curriculum, because one thing that I realized probably worth mentioning as well, especially when you talked about world history, that the history curriculum in state education system in Israel is divided to Jewish history and general history. Okay, and those work in parallel. I mean, they don't meet, and it's kind of the two different timelines. And obviously, when general history is more like American European history. So, and I think it's really interesting because it's completely disconnect the history of the state of Israel or Jewish history from the region that Israel is now in. So kind of a villa in the jungle notion. So during the 90s, there were some changes in the curriculum. And this is where I start working as a sociologist on the civic curriculum. And when I'm saying that, when I said that I was working as a sociologist, adopting a sociological perspective, so just let me say 2 sentences about that. One is that obviously when I analyze curriculum or curricular discourse or textbooks, I do it in socio-political historical context. And the other thing is looking at especially the product of curriculum discourse, such as textbook, as social artifacts and as sites for struggle, site where struggle about narratives, identity, conceptions, and etc. are conducted. They're not, I don't see them as closed texts, but definitely as texts from which you can learn about the major discursive political changes in a society. So in 1994 and later on, it was boosted in the later 90s, and also the new curriculum came to place. A textbook was published in 2000 that was defined as the official textbook, which means there's no, for several years there was no other textbook being allowed, which is quite unique today when it comes to school textbooks in Israel. And the idea, which wasn't executed very well, but the idea of the curriculum committee was to use citizenship education to create a common identity for all Israeli citizens. And understanding that this identity needs to be based on more universal liberal ideals. Having said that, it had a dual purpose. That purpose, but also the purpose, the ongoing purpose of strengthening and maintaining the Zionist Jewish identity. So, but for me as a researcher, that particular textbook, which I criticized a lot, was interesting because it was full of contradiction and full of pit holes, and that was interesting to flag out. What happened in the past 7 years? First, civic curriculum became the hot potato in public debate. I mean, it became a salient issue discussed in the Knesset, in the parliament, in the media, obviously within educational contexts like the Ministry of Education and others. And I'm not going to tire you with all the process that went on. But in a sense, we saw a shift also in terms of who controlled the curriculum from people who subscribed to the traditional Zionist approach of Israel as both Jewish and democratic, to people who subscribe to what is often referred to as New Zionism, which says Jewish first, democratic second, and only if it doesn't contradict the Jewishness of the state, and reducing the democracy to a more procedural perspective. Having said that, one thing that one of the changes that the curriculum were undergoing and still undergo, and a new textbook that was published only a year ago did, is actually bringing history and the centrality of historical narrative back into the civic curriculum. So a new chapter that called the historical narrative, it was introduced. And for me, as someone who looks at the development of curriculum, it backs the question of what is the role of history in civic curriculum, and it's a question that needs to be asked. But it's not only that more emphasis was put on Jewish history and the Jewish narrative and etc., but also the textbook reinforces or utilizes this narrative in order to strengthen Jewish identity in a very monolithic one that stressed the uniqueness of Jewish nationalism over other types of nationalism, but at the same time questions questions the Palestinian national identity, not in a common sense that it did before of excluding it, but actually questioning whether Palestinian is a national identity. And if I have one more minute, I'll just give you two quick quotes from the new textbook to explain that kind of shift. So one quote, and this is in the opening chapter of the textbook, the new textbook. It says, the phenomena of nationality expanded during modernity. However, according to many scholars, its roots predate to ancient times in history, and many of them mention the ancient Jews as a proof of the existence of ancient nationality. And it goes on, I'm not going to read everything, but then after that, students get an assignment. And again, as someone who analyzes textbooks, for me it's very important to look at the assignments the textbook gives to students, because obviously this highlights what the textbook wants students to understand. So the assignment reads, discuss and explain the similarities and differences between the development of modern nationality and the national development of the Jewish people. So again, setting it as a unit. 2 chapters later, when discuss the issue of minority, then obviously it has to address the Arab-Palestinian minority, which the textbooks mainly refer to as non-Jews. Again, it's quite telling, I think. And then they defined, they say there are 2 types of minorities, migrant minorities and indigenous minority, and they give kind of an academic definition of this. And then on a box on the side, it reads, there is a historical dispute concerning the number of Arabs living in Palestine prior to the first wave of Jewish immigration in 1882, versus the number of Arabs that migrated to Palestine at the same time as the Jewish immigration. Furthermore, there is a debate on the factual question of the natural population growth and migration factors in Arab demographic growth in the 20th century. There is no doubt that together with Jewish migration, there was also significant Arab migration in the first half of the 20th century, but its scope is a matter of historical dispute. So this is, again, questioning the very essence of Palestinian nationalism and especially the definition of Palestinians as an indigenous population.
And it's a case of what I would call denialism, which
Yes.
is a tendency
Yes.
that we see quite prominently in Israel-Palestine today. That claim in this country based on a largely discredited book entitled From Time Immemorial.
Yes.
But I want to juxtapose, if I may, Mary's and Halleli's presentation, because you, in a certain sense, stretch the spectrum of curricular possibilities to their, perhaps, to the point of greatest tension. Mary offered up what we might call the redemptive pole, whereby the soldiers come to full realization through encountering an historical text. And Halleli really highlights the chauvinistic pole inhering in curriculum development, in curricula. And I want to ask everybody on the panel, what do you think is the potential for history and historical curriculum to effect change, and I should say to effect positive change? And as if that's not a large enough question, I want to ask, do you see your own work in curriculum development as a political act? Start with you, Sami. And we'll be a little bit briefer this time so we can get a little bit more.
It does, actually. Actually, learning history and what causes all these tragedies in the world, we come to realize why this happens. why this genocide happened, why this war happened, why there's so much trauma and pain is, happening all over the world. And we unfortunately, we didn't stop sometimes to think about and learn from these is a good lessons. And that's the same story that Mary presented about these soldiers coming from Iraq. What we learn about is what we did. So it means we didn't learn much about the atrocity of history. And unfortunately, though history teaching should be a way to learn it so not to repeat it. But unfortunately, now it's being repeated under different names and different slogans and different purposes. And you can see this hopelessness of dealing with history as it didn't serve the learning lessons of how we really moved from a narrow colonial way, dehumanization of the others, and also not just dehumanization of the others, actually objectifying the others in a way that it's easy to really carry an act of war or conflict against them. I think I would say that history could be seen in two formulas. One formula is digging deep in history and trying, like working in a stone quarry, and like digging a stone and throwing it at each other's, and trying to continue. And the more we dig, the more we throw, and the more we kill from the other side, the more we hit. Or we can, dig down in this quarry and get stones to build a future together. So I think a historical moment could be a learning lessons for us to learn that. But how politically those in charge in politics, how they would be able to understand that. And unfortunately, no historian nor the educators are in control of our politics. Our politics are controlled by those people who are motivated by, some ethnocentric interest that's here and there. So we are trapped into the hope that by learning history, we really educated next generation, but unfortunately, the next generation also be leaders, or be having leaders, either through election or through dictators that continue to be controlling part of the East, at least. They're really controlling the destination, and that's important.
And do you see your work in development of curriculum as a political act?
Yes, of course. Because actually, when you try to educate people to be critical to their history and to open their pits and falls, not to believe in history as a taken for granted assumption, that's when we start seeing a change. That the next generation will be able to raise the questions, no, we don't do that. No, we cannot do that. I don't know how far that could be mobilized in a power that really put the political, orientation to a limit. We saw it in, Occupy Wall Street, for example, what happened to that. Or we see it in different places. But I see it's completely political as far as people should be in control rather than to be a few people.
Thank you. Okay, Ross, so the question is the potential of history and historical curriculum to affect change and positive change, and the extent to which that, for you, is a political act.
Yeah, I'd start with the second thing first, because that's what I found myself thinking about as you were finishing up. Going back to the controversy in the mid-1990s, we can definitely say that Lynn Cheney and those who were allied with her were political. They had political goals. And what I perceived in their position was that they had nothing but political goals, and those political goals were intended to ensure the Republican Party's control of the Congress, which they brought off in 1994 when Newt Gingrich was Speaker. And so the attack on history education was in support of one of Newt Gingrich's goals, which was to close down the National Endowment for the Humanities, to close down the Arts Endowment, to close down the whole Department of Education. You know,
guess you
fortunately,
could
we
say-
haven't heard that again since then, but it's,
Thank God he's a historian, I guess we could say, right?
yeah, so now we've been doing that again, but
Yeah.
closing those places down. But in other words, I think that political position had very little to do with kids, really. And, you know, my politics, I hope, is a kids-oriented politics. I want a more just educational system, especially in the teaching of social studies and the past. And I want kids to have a better education in those respects. And I think there are specific things we can do in the way we approach history education that can help to achieve that to some degree. But it's a very tough road to hoe, having an impact. And I'm sort of at a loss for how to do it, because we don't seem to be, as a nation, getting very far right at the moment.
Well, Facing History is continuing to do it, Mary. And you offered that redemptive account. And so let's double back to ask, do you see history as a tool of, and an effective tool of social change and movement towards justice and equality? And by extension, as a political act?
As a political act. So it's no surprise. I do see it as having an effect on change, and that can be beneficial. But I think it depends on how it's done. And to go international for a minute, after the genocide in Rwanda, they banned the teaching of history for 10 years. Right? And we can understand why, right? You know, in one sense, in that they didn't want to exacerbate the tensions by teaching a history that was fraught with, you know, discrimination, right? And at the same time, by not teaching the history, they were making things worse because you didn't have an opportunity to study, right? Northern Ireland, right? How do you, you know, if without a dual narrative approach, right? How do you bring in and look at history? I mentioned those two places because those and a number of others, Facing History has at different points helped the country, or, you know, segments of the population think about how do you reintroduce the teaching of history in a way that humanizes and that builds a more compassionate society. And for that reason, I'd say we try very hard at Facing History not to be partisan, but is it political? Yes, right? Our bias is we want a more compassionate society. We want individuals who know that their voice matters, right? And that they can have a voice in the society, no matter what their background is. And so motivating them to recognize their voice, that's political.
So how have you been able to navigate and keep your heads above water in the shifting, swirling waters of American politics? From
Great question.
Bush 1 to Clinton, Bush to
Yeah.
Obama, and now...
Yeah, and now to Trump, I think we look at, where can we play a role in helping our civic society, right? We look at, so what makes a healthy democracy? Right? And talking about history is part of that. But we look at that, you know, no matter what your political viewpoint, right? If we have a democracy that shuts down those voices, then our democracy is in trouble. If we have a democracy where you can't have different opinions, we're in trouble, right? So how do we create that democratic society where we foster civil discourse, right? Because that's the big, you know, boundary, right? If your discourse shuts down other people, then you also are contributing to getting rid of the strength of a democracy. And if that means that it's a single narrative that shuts down other viewpoints, right, that can be problematic. So what we've really tried to do is say, how do we make sure that we are strengthening civil discourse in this society by bringing in the tools, by bringing in case studies, by bringing in strategies that teachers can use, that adults can use. There's a great ad that somebody hosted for us to put in the New York Times after the election. It just was titled, "We Need to Talk." Right? You know, how do you go home at Thanksgiving when you're that, crazy Uncle Harry, right, has a different opinion than you, and you need to stay engaged. You can't just say, okay, we're not going to talk politics. Like, our country demands that we talk about our history and that we express different viewpoints when we have them, I think.
So, Halleli, you are, at least here on the panel, a critic of the existing model of civics education in Israel. Let's say tomorrow you became the Minister of Education. An unlikely proposition,
Yes.
I'll grant you that. But how would you go about the task of producing a new civics curriculum that you felt was responsible and worthy of the pupils of the society you inhabit?
Okay, I'll try to think as I go along, because I was preparing myself to a bit of a different question about the civic education being, my work being political, and maybe I'll try to tackle it through two encounters that I had in the past years. One was, on my critical work on the civic curriculum. One thing that I did, I was asked to do 2 years ago when a kind of a draft of the new textbook, part of it came. I was asked by two NGOs, one Israeli Jewish and one Palestinian Israeli, to write a report. And one thing that, I did what I do mostly when I do an academic research. I made the points and I demonstrated them by picking up quotes from the draft of the textbook. So one thing that happened, and it was quite frustrating, that when I opened the new textbook, the final version, almost all the quotes that I used in my report have been rephrased. So one might think, oh, that's a great success. This is like the real influence of an academic. But obviously the essence and the content hasn't been changed. It's just that they changed a bit of the problematic phrasing, and obviously that was only an example. But then going back to what can be done, or what should be done, and the best model that I can rely on is what I do myself when I teach. And when I teach these issues and the controversies around curriculum, civic curriculum in particularly. One thing that I do is whenever I enter a classroom at the beginning of the year, I start by telling them, okay, education is political. Okay? And everything we do here and talk here and the way we engage with the topics is political. And my politics is X, Y, and Z. Now deal with it. You want to present a counter view, that's fine. But we're doing politics here. And then we talk a lot about what does it mean to be a critical scholar, in what I mean by critical scholar, in terms of the ability to question the power relations behind what we learn in textbooks or the way the education system is being organized, and etc. And I give them the tools to do that, to ask critical questions. And then I just provide them the materials, and we read them together. And apart from them being able at the end of the year to reach, without me telling them, to reach similar conclusion, maybe different because they have different politics, but similar conclusions to what I have on the textbook. But also through that, and this is in a way connects to you, to be reflexive about their own identities. That's for me a great achievement. So what I would like to see in a textbook is a textbook that provides the space to be reflective and critical about one's own identity. And I think talking of a Jewish Israeli, it's especially important in terms, and difficult, because it's recognizing, as the soldier that you gave an example, recognizing, being reflective about the Jewish Israeli narrative. It's also, for me at least, and my experience as well, it's a painful process of recognizing that sometimes, or maybe a lot, you're on the wrong side of the story here.
Great. Okay, we're going to now transition to the final portion of our evening. I'm going to stand here at the podium and open up for questions. And if you don't have any questions, I'll be happy to continue to ask our panelists another round. But if there are questions, what I'm going to do, I'm going to take a batch of questions, and then we'll give everybody an opportunity to respond as they see fit. So I have 2 questions back there. Someone will bring a microphone to you, the person in the back row, and then the person in front of the person in the back row. I see a hand here and a hand there. Okay. So we'll
In response to the comment about the soldier who was in Iraq, I had a similar experience. I used to work for veterans prior to my job at Santa Monica College. And one of my veterans was a member of the 101st Airborne. And he was telling me these outrageous, at the time I thought was outrageous stories about some of the things that he did when he was in Vietnam. Because I work with a lot of veterans and they would exaggerate their experiences. Some of them would say they did this and that and they worked in the mailroom. So what happened, I was watching Nightline one night and he was talking about this special unit called the Tiger something in Vietnam. They was interviewing people who were victimized. They had to cut off their ears, cut off heads. They did all sorts of things. They had a calling card. They would leave with their victims. And I thought about my former student, and I see now why he had problems with substance abuse, because he had nightmares and he could not live with himself. But when you talked about what that soldier saw in Iraq, it brought back memories of my former soldier who was in Vietnam, and my reaction when I saw it on Nightline was just, I was mortified. So what was your reaction when you heard that he said we did the same thing?
Thank you. We're going to take, if you could just pass that to the woman, right? Yes, please, go ahead.
Hi, thank you. Thank you for 4 very interesting talks on the power of curriculum in shaping our understanding of ourselves and our place in the world. I think everybody here would agree that curriculum worldwide probably benefit from some sort of revision. But I see another problem in our educational system, and it's not just curriculum, and I wanted to bring it to the forefront and see what your thoughts on it are. So I'm, for example, very familiar with Professor Dunn's website, World History for All, and I've definitely used the resources, and I think what you presented about facing history and the reputation of this organization that's been available to teachers since 1976 is incredible. California just went through, I believe it was a 7-year revision of the social science framework. And I'm wondering if there was anyone, either from World History for All or Facing History, that participated with the Board of Education in revising this. Because the problem that I see is that, okay, perhaps we don't have a Ministry of Education, but we still have a Board of Education in each state that creates the textbook that the teachers use. And moreover, I think that, at least in my experience in school and watching my siblings go through school, and I have volunteered in LAUSD schools, is a lot depends on the teacher training. So the teachers, although they might have wonderful textbooks that engage various cultures, will pick and choose to teach the students the cultures that they're most familiar with, which brings us once again back to Western civilization. And then teachers will not go out of their way, given everything else that they have to do with their union rules and everything else that happens today with regulations, they don't go out of their way to access World History for All or go to Facing History seminars that you guys host.
I think we need to move towards.
I apologize. So that's my question. Could you maybe respond to the instructional training and cross?
Thank you.
Yeah.
Okay,
Sorry.
I'm going to ask folks to be a little bit briefer from this point forward. Yes, sir.
Yeah, try to be brief. This is a question for Professor Adwan. Obviously, the rest of the panel can weigh in. But dual narratives, for all their laurels, are still separate narratives. And I'm sure you thought that at the nascency of your project, you were thinking, okay, maybe how do I stave off the prospect of the dual narratives inviting an entrenchment in, I would say, in a binary entrenchment in any one narrative. How would you have obviated that? One side sticking to the one and so forth.
Thank you.
Not so ancillarily to that. What about the modality of having maybe one, I guess you can call it syncretic, integrated, or however you want to call it, amalgamated narrative wherein you juxtapose facts, empirical facts from both stories, side by side. Like, for example, if you talk about the 1930s, 1940s, conquest of labor, and the Jewish National Fund buying land, and as a correlate of that, Felachim that were not landowners were evicted. And you just put it side by side, and there's something about that may take the venom away from one fact to another.
Excellent question. We took this up at great length in our conference, but Sami has now worked out an answer to it. So, yes, please.
For Sami and Halleli, am I doing
Yes.
your name right? Who would you wish to see at the table in the revision of history books of Israel/Palestine? Is there space at the table for Bedouin or for Greek Orthodox, or are these two minor groups to be taken into consideration?
Okay, thank you. We're now going to have our panelists offer their remarks, which will be our concluding remarks for the evening, and we can continue the conversation over a reception after. We'll begin with Sami.
I just, when I hear the soldiers and the gentleman speaking, I just reminded by this movement in Israeli even military, where this organization called Breaking the Silence. And this group of soldiers, start speaking out how brutal when they were invading Palestinian homes at night, waking people, children, destroying doors, and waking people in their private homes, and in the middle of the night, screaming, searching, etc. So how would that be encouraged? Even I know the Israeli government are opposing this, and they really try to discredit them, but this action is repeated even nowadays by younger soldiers. It's the same thing, It's like this thing is repeated, under the presupposition of security wanted. So the whole family has to be traumatized. So it's being repeated. So it's the same thing with the soldiers, the same thing with that. And it's still, we are witnessing that every day. And it's a nightmare for the Palestinian because they don't know. Like my wife is back home by herself. And she said, I cannot stay home by myself. I said, why? I have to go with my daughter and stay with her. And I asked her why. I said, what if they come at that night? What I will do? So it's now, this is the scenarios we are repeating in different format in that. In relating, you ask about the Board of Education. I will maybe try to respond to the Palestinian Curriculum Center. I think they know it all. They think that they don't need another advice. They think they have all the skills. They don't invite really an open scholars who try to look beyond these boundaries that they created for them. And the last batch of school textbooks that were produced in the Palestinian are really, I'm ashamed that our ministry produced them because they lack all this kind of critical thinking, of developing the personality, of engaging, empowering, etc. It's only indoctrination. So they think they have it all, in themselves, and they don't need our experience. And even those Palestinians who work in, beyond the boundaries they fit, they call them, they stereotype them, they are normalizers, or they are not addressing the national interest of the country, so they don't call them. That's for the Palestinian thing.
Take one more minute.
Yeah, it's true. It's true. Sometimes you have to look at this as a process. It's true when you read, you think you are really entrenching your own position. But it's shocking for you, first. The second way, if you can stay at that level, it depends on you, but you can move after you find out, even psychologically, it's not easy for you to listen to others saying you have to defend yourself, so you want really treat yourself in your position. But at certain point, that will motivate you to read more about your own narrative And by the virtue of reading more and more, you expose to multi-narrative, then you start going back, oh, the other side narrative has some kind of validity or reliability. So we're looking at it as a process, and this is the fear. That's why when we designed the booklet, we put both side narrative, but we put empty space. I don't know if you saw the book. There's empty space in the middle, and the empty space that really create that way of that. Otherwise, yeah, it is in a way that. And sometimes even when this being, introduced like to your student and they have to take positions. And we didn't mean that, you have to take position. It's up to you to take a position. It's up to you how to relate to that. And from our experiences with our teachers, some of them are here, students, I think they become much more interested in learning more and more. And by that, it's challenging the system that they live in.
Thank you. Ross.
Right. I'd like to address the question about the California framework because I did participate in the development of it. Young lady also mentioned world history for us all. I just want to point out that this is an online curriculum for world history in middle and high schools, and its home is now the what should I call it, David? The Public History and Outreach Program within the History Department at UCLA. So I'm very pleased about that. About the framework development, the most how can I put it? Sort of annoying thing about the whole process, and this requires a historical context, is that this framework was first developed in the mid-1980s, and it was a framework that intended to be inclusive insofar as it would present silo-centered civilizational history in 6th grade and part of 7th grade. So everybody gets in there, Africans, Chinese, so on. And then near the end of 7th grade, it suddenly becomes Eurocentric and remains heavily Eurocentric right through 10th grade. And that's what we had, and I was happy in some ways not at all. But then in 1998, the legislature ordered, with the governor behind it, standards for history, which is different from the framework. But the legislature said the standards must be compatible with the framework. So we developed the history social science standards compatible with the framework. Then in this past couple of years, the framework was revised again, but the legislature said, we're not going to change the standards. So the new framework is based on the standards, which is based on the earlier framework. So in effect, in terms of its basic structure, as I described it, we have a curriculum in California schools that's about a quarter of a century old. Well, 30 years old. And so we were really hamstrung in a large extent to doing anything very innovational. And the other thing I would just mention is that there were a lot of people standing around the pot and stirring the soup. A lot of people from a lot of different directions. And that made it difficult too, so that things that I thought were going to happen in the framework, in the end, they didn't happen, even though nobody told me that they weren't going to happen. As I've sometimes said in the past, I'd love to have a national curriculum for history in the schools, but only if I and my close colleagues get to write it.
Thank you, Ross. Mary.
So I'll just add to that. So I was not part of writing it, but for those who aren't familiar, there were, hundreds of public comments and pages of that. The document itself is over 1,000 pages. Hasn't been released yet in book form. So, and there's various pieces of legislation that try to make it more inclusive in one way or another. So it is very political, in the state trying to get that framework. There are some, I think points of hope within it too, of looking at how, all of the things did come together in trying to create a more critical inquiry as the approach to studying history, which
Yeah,
will
I think that was a
hopefully-
success, yeah.
Yeah, hopefully will be good. My response to the gentleman in the seminar, I think my key role in that space was to really just create the space for him to be reflective. I think there is amazing power in the humility that comes with recognizing within ourselves the capacity to do evil as well as the capacity to do good. And that's part of what allows us to see that and humanize another. And I think the dehumanization that can happen towards others dehumanizes ourselves as well. And the moments where that humanity can come back to us because of those moments of reflection, those are moments for the individual. So that was, it was about creating the space for that person.
Thank you, Mary. Halleli, final word.
Okay, so two quick comments. One about whether different minority groups should participate in creating the curriculum. I think I would like to put forward a different question before that. And I mean, we take for given, at least in Israel, that there is a common curriculum for all. And a common curriculum always creates a problem in terms of how it provides for the needs of different groups. And for me, this has been a question, at least to be raised. I'm not sure about what the right answer, but whether we need to have a singular curriculum. But if we do decide to go on the path of a singular curriculum, one of the problems of the Israeli curriculum, both the history and the civic and other curriculum, that it's the people who are involved in writing it are people who come from the hegemonic majority group. And obviously that's a problem. I just want to say one thing, quick thing about teachers. And what I learned from my research in Israel and also my interaction with teachers throughout the years is, especially in Israel, civic teachers, that often many of them, especially now with the curriculum changes, took their frustration to try and think how they can use the current trends in the curriculum critically in the classroom. Mm-hmm. And obviously it's not all of the teachers, and I'm not sure it's the majority, but for me, if I want to look to end in an optimistic note, then looking at those teachers who are able to engage their students in reflective, critical discussion about the textbook, which says that, then I think, that's quite amazing. And in nowadays in Israel, they're quite brave as well.
That's a great segue to an invitation to everybody here to come to our conference on history and education in Israel and Palestine tomorrow at 9 a.m. We will be hearing from Israeli and Palestinian teachers who've actually taught the dual narrative curriculum that Sami Adwan has developed. I encourage you all to come, and I thank you all for this evening, in particular to our four panelists, each of whom brought such a unique perspective.